Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Annyeonghasimnika. Good day to all the organizers, resource speakers, and participants in the UP Korea Research Center 2022 Philippine Koreanist Congress with the theme Transcending the Past, the Korean Diaspora Inside and Outside the Peninsula. This is Ambassador Teresa Dizon de Vega of the Philippine Embassy in Korea. 저는 필리핀 대사 테레사 데 베가입니다. I am honored to offer a short congratulatory message to acknowledge the efforts undertaken by the UPKRC and its partners, the Scalabrini Migration Center, the Ateneo Department of Political Science, the Ateneo Korean Studies Program, and the UP Arirang. While there continues to be very active engagement, particularly in the area of people-to-people exchanges between the Philippines and Korea, it is equally important for platforms such as the Philippine Koreanist Congress to continue to flourish, to provide an academic and research-based context to the different developments arising from increased engagements between the Philippine and Korean diasporas. This is a topic whose scope, breadth, and depth has yet to be fully mined and studied. I am sure the talks by distinguished speakers, Dr. In Jin Yoon of Korea University and the Korea International Migration Studies Association, and Dr. Dong-yeob Kim of the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies of Busan University of Foreign Studies will provide enlightening inputs on the Korean diaspora and particularly the Korean diaspora in the Philippines. Migration is one of the defining themes and phenomena of the 21st century. It connects peoples from different countries, cultures, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Its patterns are a product of political, social, and economic changes. By taking the effort to learn more about and to discuss this phenomena, we can develop a better understanding of what makes us different, what spurs our mobility, and how we can build more inclusive, multicultural communities. The Philippine Embassy hopes this activity will provide much food for thought and a better understanding of the ties between the Philippines and Korea, a relationship anchored on shared historic sacrifices, but also confidently facing the future together. Many thanks once again to the UPKRC Director, Kyung-min Bae, and Professor Javier of the University of the Philippines Linguistics Department for kindly allowing the Philippine Embassy in Korea to take part in this laudable event. Once again, kamsahamnida. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Magandang hapon po. Annyeonghaseyo. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome to today's event, the 4th Philippine Koreanist Congress, organized by the UP Korea Research Center. I am Au from the Ateneo Korean Studies Program, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to welcome our participants joining us in the safety of their homes through YouTube live streaming. We also wish to thank our partner institutions, Scalabrini Migration Center, the Ateneo Department of Political Science, the Ateneo Korean Studies Program, and the UP Arirang. UPKRC wishes to express its profound gratitude to its partners for their unwavering support and for always making its events more meaningful. And welcome everyone who joined us virtually. We wish to greet everyone and hope that all of you will have a fruitful learning experience this afternoon. Before we begin our program, we would like to remind our viewers of our house rules. You may type in your questions and comments for our panelists throughout the event in the YouTube comment section. Kindly introduce yourself first and the school or organization you are affiliated when asking your question. The questions will then be collected and answered during the open forum. We also would like to remind everyone that this forum is a safe space and thus will not tolerate any form of bullying and trolling, academic or otherwise. The organizer reserves the right to remove those who will create any disruption in any part of the program. We'd also like to inform you that this event will be recorded. So let's begin. Today, we will have Dr. Dong-yeob Kim, who will talk about the Korean migrants in the Philippines, their history and identity. Let me introduce today's guest speaker. Dr. Dong-yeob Kim is an associate professor and the director of the Korea Institute for ASEAN Studies at the Busan University of Foreign Studies. He obtained his PhD in political science from the University of the Philippines, Diliman in 2003. Currently, he is the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, a KCI indexed Korean journal, and the publisher of Suvarnabhumi, multidisciplinary journal of Southeast Asian Studies, which is a Scopus indexed English journal. He also serves as the vice president of the Korean Association of Southeast Asian Studies. He has published a number of books and articles locally and internationally, including Transforming Western Democracy in Southeast Asia, The Case of Lanao del Sur, the Philippines, ASEAN-Korea Relations, 25 Years of Partnership and Friendship, and the Korean translation of Noli Me Tangere. His most recent work is The Korean Migrants in the Philippines, History and Identity, a book published in 2021. His research interests include democracy and development in East Asia, focusing on the Philippines and South Korea, and ASEAN studies. So everyone, let us all welcome Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim, the virtual floor is yours whenever you are ready.
Okay, Dr. Javier. It is my great pleasure to attend this Congress. And from Dr. Javier introduced me as a very kind and generous introduction you gave me. Especially I spent around 9 years in the Philippines. I did my master and PhD in UP Diliman. So actually, Philippines is my second home. I always feel home whenever I go to Philippines. Because of this pandemic, I wasn't able to visit the Philippines last 2 years. I think my last visit was February 19. So after around 2 years, I could not visit. Every sem break, I visit Philippines. I meet my friends and colleagues. So I think the pandemic is almost over. So I hope I can visit again from next sem break. Well, I am very glad to share my research outcome. This is actually it took 3 years to wrote these books, and probably I can introduce this research in this short times very briefly. So probably I can begin my presentation. The title is The Korean Migrant in the Philippines, History and Identity. Okay, so I will talk about very briefly about introduction and history of Korean migration to the Philippines and national identity of Koreans in the Philippines. And I make the very short closing remarks. Okay. So for this research, I will give some background. This is a research background. There's 3 logos, right? That's the Academy of Korean Studies, that is provide the money. We need money for the research. And the second one is the Korean Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Initially, this identity we apply for this project, and the Academy of Korean Studies granted our fund for 3 years project. If you're looking at here, 2006 to 2019, we conduct this research. So this is not only myself, but we have the research team covering entire Southeast Asia, only except Brunei, because in Brunei we don't have any, probably there's some Korean, but not significant. So 9 countries we covered in these studies. Of course, I covered the Philippines. And this one is a Korean Association of Southeast Asian Studies. These 2 institutes was merged recently. So now there's no, there's a Korean Institute, ISIS, Korean Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, but it under the Korean Association of Southeast Asian Studies. Okay, this is the organization we conduct this research. And the objective of this study was to expand Korean diaspora studies beyond the conventional regions. In Korea, we have some studies about Korean diaspora, but mainly focus on the Koreans in US, China, Japan, or former Soviet Union, or Europe. There's no any studies about Korean diaspora in Southeast Asia. So we, as an expert in this area studies, we propose this proposal, and we get the fund from the institute. So why we need to study about ASEAN, the Koreans in ASEAN region? Because the number of Koreans in this region is quite increasing. And the immigration type is quite different. So in order to expand the research area of the diaspora, we need to study in these regions. So that is the rationale why we conduct this region, to study about the Koreans. And this is statistics about Korean diaspora. As of 2021, we have around 7.5 million Koreans living abroad. Mainly, if you're looking at the these maps, there's China is the number 1 country, is about 34.4% of Korean overseas Koreans live in China. Second is the United States, 33.5%, and around 11% living in Japan. And this is the former CIS is the former Soviet Union, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. There's a number of Koreans are living there, and others also in Europe. Also, there's some Koreans are living there. Okay, so in this study, individual researchers have their own topics, but for myself, I mainly focus on the identity. So identity studies of Korean diaspora. So there's some literatures about origins and factors to determine national identities. In case of the Koreans, there's in China there is some why the Koreans go to there, and what is the determinant factors to determine their national identities. That is actually the China, Japan, and CIS, the former Soviet Union, is neighboring countries. The colonial history is the main factors to main reason for them to move there or migrate that areas. In case of China, Chinese government or Chinese state has their own minority ethnic minority policies that mainly affect Korean national identities in that countries. In case of USA, the origin is probably economic regions, American dreams. They move there for their own economic opportunities. They pursue economic opportunities. And their identity is quite different from the first and second generation and 1.5 generations. The generation gap is quite important factors to determine their national identity. And also there's some social and racial discrimination. Also one of the important factors to determine the Korean diaspora's national identity. In case of Japan, historically we have very close relationship with Japan because Japan colonized Korea, and during that colonial time, many Koreans moved to Japan. So after the World War II, the Koreas we achieved the independence. We call this liberalization. But right after liberalization, our territory was divided by North Korea and South Korea. So some Koreans in Japan, they attached to North Korea. Some Koreans attached to South Korea. So there's some divisions, and that also affect their identities. And of course, in Japanese society, there's some discrimination against the foreigners, especially the Koreans. In case of the CIS, former Soviet Union, the Stalin has a national policy, disperse the Korean residents, because the Korean residents, they stayed in border areas, and that areas so many Koreans, and the Stalin government, they forced them to move to Kazakhstan and East Central Asian areas. So the Koreans, they lose their identities because they place them, scattered. They don't have any more the Korean community, so to speak. In case of China, the Koreans, they have their own communities, and the government provided some advantages for the ethnic minorities. So they can keep their own Korean communities as ethnic minorities. But in case of the CIS case, there's no that kind of privilege from the state. So many of Koreans living in CIS, they lose their Korean identity. They cannot speak Korean languages, and that's it. And in European case, in Europe case, it's very similar to the US. They pursue the economic opportunities, and also they experience some social discrimination. There is a factor to determine the Koreans' national identities. How about in Asia? In this study, this is the cover of the book. This is all our research team. They contribute one chapters, and we publish this Korean in Southeast Asia. So in this study, we try to research about the context, history, economic opportunity, and national policies. And agent who move, what was the reason why, what kind of people move to Southeast Asia? That is the agent. And the living condition or living environment. Actually, most of, including Philippines, ASEAN countries like Korea are not immigrant countries that do not provide citizenship other than naturalization. So most of the Koreans living in Southeast Asia, they keep their the Korean passport, their Korean nationality. So they stay there as foreigners. And since that is different from the Koreans in China, Koreans in USA, or Koreans in other countries, most of the other countries, they try to have their own citizenship, like American citizenship, some of them Japanese citizenship, or Chinese citizenship. But most of the Koreans in Southeast Asia, they keep their Korean citizenship. Okay, so that it was a difference. In theoretical aspects, there's some theories in the international migrations explain about the causes and the directions. Usually the causes explained by the push-pull effect. That is a very famous theories in international migrations. And also there's some various factors to determine the directions from where to move to or migrate to places. many things, political, economic, social factors, state policies or interstate agreements. Those things determine the directions of migrations. Probably if you're interested in, you can look for some literatures. And method of the diaspora studies, there are many methods can be. If the history of migration is long enough and there's the number is big enough, probably you can use some social research method. But if the history is very short and there's no accumulated data and the number is not huge enough to make any statistical research, this autobiography usually we use by interview and narrative analysis method can be applied. Okay. This method is valid because while we're studying identity, because the identity itself naturally subjective. So there is a valid method. And there are some merits. Individual experiences and memories could refurnish the social and historical memories. Of course, there are some limitations in this method. That is the lack of objectivity, because we rely on their memories and their own narratives. So we cannot prove it is really truth or not, right? So the readers must read between the lines while taking into account the context. Okay, so this is the subjective stories and subjective histories. So we have to consider these merits and limitations in reading this kind of literatures. So history of Korean migration to the Philippines. I will make the very quick reviewing the history of the two countries, the historical records and early contacts. So how we can know since when the Koreans visit Philippines and live there. There's some record, probably our Filipino audience may be familiar with this book, so Philippine Islands, 1419-32. This is a record of Spanish officials, missionaries, and accumulation of these documents. Anyway, in this document, there are several, the Korea was used to several names, Korai, Korai, Kore, but this entire Philippine island is 53 volumes. But in 9 volumes, you can find mentioning about Korea. There is some mentioning very short about the plan for the missionary dispatch, or some in the letters there is some mention about Korea, especially in this Imjin Weran. This is a Japanese invasion to Korea during this 1592 to 1598. During this time, there are many things mentioned about Korea. At the time, it was Joseon. And there's an interesting story about the Thomas. He's a Korean Christian. And this story is in the volume in the year is 1618. So it's almost pioneer of Korean Christian, because before, actually the first Christianity was introduced to Korea is this book. This is Jibong Nusol, written in 1614. In this book is the first time Christianity introduced to Korea. So there was a Christian Korean converted to Christian, was in 1618. Is very interesting, or is worth to research about this. Okay. So in Philippine side, this book can be a reference for the first contact, early contact. In case of Korean side, we have this book, Jibong Nusol, written by the Lee Su-bang. And in Korea, he's the pioneer of Southeast Asian studies. Actually, in this book, there is a Jo Wan-byuk. This is a chapter of Jo Wan-byuk. Here, they explain about one Korean name is Jo Wan-byuk. He visited Vietnam and Philippines. This is Jongmyo-jeran, is the war between Qing Dynasty and Joseon Dynasty. Qing Dynasty actually invaded to Joseon during these times, and they captured some prisoners, and probably he's the one of that war prisoners and brought to Southeast Asia. So this is the only record or document we can refer to. And 19th centuries, there is interesting stories. This is Moon Sun-duk's drift record. Moon Sun-duk is the he's the skate seller. This is a fish, kind of fish. It has a very big, and he accidentally drifted from here, and he drifted to the Okinawa. From Okinawa again, he drifted to Philippines. Probably that place today is a Bigan place. And from there, he returned to Korea. At the time, it was Joseon, through the China. Okay, so he's a merchant. He's a merchant, and there's one scholar. His name is the Jong Yak-jeon. He listened his stories and make it record in his book Pyohaesimal. This is the book Pyohaesimal, and this is the first written record that introduced Philippines to Korean societies. So this is an important record related with the Korea and Philippine relations. Okay. There's some, actually there are many similarities between Korea and the Philippines. So historical parallel in 1905. There's these two figures is Taft and Kasura. Is Taft and his Kasura. Kasura is the, during that time, Prime Minister of Japan. And he's a General Taft. Taft is famous in the Philippines too, right? They have the secret agreement. This secret agreement is about do not interfere your own colonial policies. So America will colonize, and they will do their colonial policies in the Philippines. Japan, at the time, their power is emerging, right? So do not interfere our colonial policies. That is one side. The other side is Japan. We have intention to control Joseon at the time, Korea. So do not interfere our affairs. So that these two big powers, they make the secret agreement, and they focus on their own colonial control of these two countries. So from this 1905, in fact, actually, officially, Korea was colonized by the Japan 1910, but since 1905, they already control our sovereignties. So that is the one of the historical parallel between these two countries. And under Japanese colony, in case of Korea, right, 1910 to 1945, during that time, Koreans are people who have no countries. They are under Japanese colonies. So they don't have any Korean passport. They use the Japanese passport or other passport. During that time, some Koreans visit the Philippines. Famous person, An Chang-ho, he's the one of the independent leaders in Korea during the Japanese colonial times. He visited the Philippines 1929. Why he visited the Philippines that time? To find a peaceful place for Korean diaspora. And he met some probably colonial administrators during that times. And they tried to negotiate, but he failed to get any places in the Philippines. Anyway, his visit was one of the history. The other one is the Hong Saik. if you're looking at his uniform, he's a Imperial Japanese Army. He's a Korean, but he joined the Japanese Imperial Armies, and he Lieutenant General. He dispatched to the Philippines, and after the war, sadly he sentenced and executed in the Philippines as a war criminals. He's one of the sad story about Koreans during these colonial times. The other one is the Park Yun-ha. Actually, he's a pioneer of the Korean society in the Philippines. He came to Philippines for studying and married to Filipinas, and he died in the accident in 1978. Anyway, his sons and daughters are still living in the Philippines. He organized the Korean societies, and he was the lead that society for 10 years. So if you visit there's office for United Korean associations, you will find these pictures there. Okay, and after that, war and poverty in 1945 to 1960s. Actually, this time is the Koreans are people in the time of trials. It was we have the 1945. We have liberation from Japanese colony, and 1950 we have the Korean War, where the Filipinos they send the troops and they help. So these two countries became the blood alliance until today, right? So it is a quite important historical moment. These two countries became very close tie. And if you're looking at the picture, this is the probably picture about the marriage between Korean woman with the Filipino. Because the Philippine, they joined our Korean War, and also after the war, there are many military personnel who work for reconstruction project in Korea. So some Korean women married the Filipino soldiers or military personnel. And there is some record about 50 Korean wives, they live in the Philippines. So I think that is the first generation Korean society in the Philippines. Another historical parallel is the martial law, right? Political turmoil and economic development. If you're looking at this 1972, very similar time, right? Just less than 1 month difference. These two countries declared martial laws and start dictatorship. During this martial law, the economic development is different, right? This the green graph is the Korea. During this martial law period, Korea was successfully conducted our economic development, but Philippines was not successful in terms of the economic development. So there's a different there's gap is widened between these two countries in terms of the economic status. So in 70s and 80s, some Koreans they migrate to the Philippines. Actually, during that times, many Koreans, especially these Koreans, they are elite in Korean society, because during these times, not everyone can go abroad because they should get the permission from the government. They should have the specific reason to go abroad. So during that times, if you go abroad, you have passport. It means you are already certain level in the Korean societies. So during this time, 1970s, some Korean companies, they already invest they do business in the Philippines, and they send some their employees. So those people, they go to Philippines during these times. And also many Korean Christian missionaries, they go to Philippines during these times. So since they are elite groups, actually they are backbone of the Korean society in the Philippines until recently. Now they are very much old, but almost 20 or 30 years. They are backbone of the Korean community or Korean society in the Philippines. Now, mass influx of Koreans to the Philippines. These two, this is newscasters. They declared the liberalization policy of overseas travel for Koreans. Before 1989, the Koreans cannot go abroad freely, but since then, you can go freely. So that is one of the moments. Many Koreans, they start going abroad. And another one is 2006, liberalization policy of overseas investment. Now you can bring money from Korea to invest in the foreign countries. So if you're looking at this graph, the number of Koreans in the Philippines, until 1990s, a very small number of Koreans live in the Philippines. Since then, it drastically, right, rapidly increasing the number. Okay, since 1990s, there are many reasons, but many of them find a new life in the Philippines. So these two, he's now vice president of the Korean Society in the Philippines, and his choice, he's graduate from UP, and now he's a lawyer. He's naturalized. He liked to practice law in the Philippines, so he applied for natural. He has enough scores to be naturalized. So he's a Philippine citizen, and he living in the many cases. In his case, he go to there as a tourist, but he liked the living environment in the Philippines, and he started his business in the Philippines. Okay. Now, the Korean society, the Philippine Korean Society, I named it Chapter 1. Before mid-20s, enclave communities, enclave societies, they are living in the Philippines, but there is a small Korean societies, and they interact themselves, not much interact with the local peoples. There's a language academy, Korean math, and churches, and even the intermarriage couples, they don't interact with the local peoples. They have their own community to interact. But since mid-2000s, I came back to Korea 2003. Up to 2003, not much interaction between Koreans and local peoples. But after I came back, probably there's a wave of Korean wave, and the Filipinos are like some Korean cultures, and many Koreans, they go there and they begin to involve in or interact with the local peoples. Like this is a famous brand, right? Samgyup Salamat is a Korean restaurant. It became the popular, and also many Koreans, they engage in the local affairs. I brought this to, this is the YouTube channels. They are intermarriage couples, and they are living in the Philippines, and they have their own kids. I think in the future, the mainstream probably can be changed from the Korean couples to intermarriage couples in terms of the Korean diaspora, because this kind of phenomena was increased because of the pandemic. During this pandemic time, many Koreans, they returned to Korea, but these intermarriage couples, they stay there and they find their own way of living there, and I think their community became the stronger. So I think they will be the mainstream of the Korean society in the Philippines in the future. Okay, I think you don't give me the time limitation. I just go myself. If time is too much, please let me know. Okay, national identity of diasporas. Usually, if you're living in abroad, probably you will question about who am I, right? So when we say identity, identity means both sameness and also selfhood. Sameness is about being, you cannot change. But selfhood is becoming, you want to be something. That is changeable things. When we say national identity, defined as a changeable identity, which is the selfhood. So you can change your identity. I'm Korean, but if I like, I can be Americans. If I apply for citizenships and I prepare everything for being a American citizenship, and I want to be Americans in the future, and I live my life in that directions. That is the changeable. National identity is changeable, and national identity is inherit and change over generations. So my second generation became more Americans, and my third generation became totally Americans, gradually generation to generation. What is the determinant factors for their own national identities? Probably relative socioeconomic condition of the motherland to the host countries, and also intermarriage status, you are intermarried or not. Probably there's other sources to determine your national identities. So I make the periodization of the Korean migrant in the Philippines, and each period have different identity, orientation of their national identities. So I make the period before 1970 and 70s and 80s and after 1990s. So I make this period. First period is this picture is this is Manila in 1960s. Okay. So socioeconomic condition for the migration is the Philippines has a much better conditions than Korea. Okay. So motivation of migration is away from the war-torn country, Korea, and move to a more advanced societies. So who moved, who migrate? Marriage migrants and some, a few commercial migrants. These commercial migrants from, some of them came from Japan. Under the colonial time, they moved to Japan, and after independence, they did not go to Korea and move to another countries. Some of them came to Philippines. And their national identities prefer Philippine identity or more advanced countries, USA identity over Korean identity. The Korean identity has no attractions. Probably for them, it's not the valuable things to keep. So they want to have the Philippine identity. How do you measure this? For example, like those Koreans during that times, they did not teach Koreans for their kids, and they most of them they more teaching them. See, they try to their children to be Filipinos or Americans in the later. Okay. Okay, there's some settings a little bit change it. That's why I confused. Okay. Okay, yeah. So 1970s and 80s, I told you that during this time, some Korean elites, they moved to Philippines, right? For them, during these times, Korea began to surpass the economic status of the Philippines. And their motivation is to probably some of them company employee, or some of them they are international organization expatriate, because you have the WHO and you have the ADB. So some Koreans they work there and they go there. And also there's some missionaries working in doing their missionary job in the Philippines. for them, the Korean or Philippine identity is not valuable for them. They want to pursue the American identities. During that times, most of the Koreans, they send their children to the international schools. And after graduation, they send them to America. And most of them, they like their children to be American citizens. They settle there, and probably they cannot change their own the living space, but they want to their children to be Americans. Many of them, not all, we cannot generalize, but many of them, they did that course. It means their orientation for their identities, American identities. And after 1990s, since the Korean wave was strong, the Korean soft power became stronger, and many of them, they like to keep Korean identities. They don't want to be anymore the foreign American or Filipinos. Now the Korea is much advanced in terms of economics, advanced countries. Okay? And this time, unspecified mass in accordance with various. There's so many reasons to visit the Philippines during these times. Okay. Now I will introduce about one case. His name is Kim Yong-chan. He has very interesting and very unique national identities. Okay. I call this the post-national identity, probably transnational identity, whatever. Anyway, the approach to doing this research is Schultz narrative analysis. The first step, chronological description of oral life history. Second, analyze the narratives on the national identity in the context of his life stories. Actually, this narrative analysis, the data came from the interview. So in order to have the valuable data, you need they call this LAPO, very close relationship between the interviewee and interviewers. In case of the Yong-chan Kim, it was I met him several times. Actually, he's a UP graduate, and I met so many times. So we have LAPO, we have the personal relationship. Even he came to Korea, visit Busan, and I invite him to one of my class to give a lecture. So we have a good relationship. And before he passed away, and before he died, I met the last interview with him. So that interview data is the resource of these studies. This is I get from his Facebook. This person is the Yong-chan Kim, and he's a happy family. He's a happy grandfather. His wife, his son, daughter, son-in-law, and daughter-in-law. Very multinational families. His wife is Filipina. His son married with the Chinese origin Filipina, and his daughter married with a Filipino. So it's multinational families. I asked. He got the cancer, and he invited me to speak about himself. So we met his house. I met him his house, and we talked. And he said his old entire stories. So he defined his life stages, 4 life stages. He was born in 1948, and up to 1961. He lived in Korea. He spent his childhood in Korea. He experienced wartime trials, unhappy memories of childhood under his father, modern elite father. He's a government employee, study in America, But his mother is very traditional, no education, so there is always conflict. And he himself was, he said, a troublesome child. He doesn't study, make problems, always punished by his fathers, and his mother always tried to keep him safe. And in 1961, he followed his father to Rome because his father worked in the international organizations. FAO, this food international UN organizations. And he spent his adolescence in Bangkok, in Rome and Bangkok. During his life in Rome, he experienced some racial inferiority complex, in racial discriminations. I think it was very deep in his mind. So when he graduated, when he has brother. Once he finished, his brother finishes high school, and he immediately go to America to further study higher educations. His father asked him to go America, but he reject. I don't want to go America because the white man. Once his father moved to his office, moved to Rome to Bangkok. He attended the international school there, but probably he told me that he was not a good student. He always flunked. But he said he was very happy in Bangkok because we're same Asians. There's no racial discriminations. And his father introduced one Filipino as his godfather to him, and his godfather take care of him in Manila. In 1967, he came to Philippines, and he spent his until he dies. He spent his life in the Philippines. Okay. And he life stage 4 is it's at 1987. It is you have the democratization, right? Before this time, he worked for the one international organization, is kind of fisheries. Actually, that organization, that international organization made by Japanese, and he was working for that organizations. And he resigned, and from 1987 he start his own business with his wife. He made a bag. His bag is very. You can find in the SM. They have their own shop. So since 1987, because of his business, he reconnect with the Korea. He visit Korea, learn about how to make the bag, and he was quite successful. And he was have enough time, and he have enough space to retrospect his own life. And he was thinking about who am I and his own identities. Okay. So there's some narratives. From his narratives, we can find his identities, relation with his parents and his own family. This is his words. Actually, it's a trend. He spoke to me Korean. My wife keeps asking me things these days, and I wish I could be kind before I die. I want to do that, but I can't. My wife is good, but I feel awkward because my father did. I thought it was because I grew up without love, but now I think that's how I was born. That's what I learned from the books. So the parenthood is quite important for the child's national identities. But in case of Kim, he did not have that kind of influence from his parents. So lack of affection for parents and families. So he grew up and live as an independent subject. So he can choose his own national identities. And a lack of socialization process. If you live in Korea, we have some educations, right? In the school, you have the socialize. You have some subject teaching about the national identities. So, but he has no, because in the young age, he moved to the abroad, and there is no systematic education for the national or as a Korean national identities. How about his living environment in the Philippines? When I enrolled the Philippine high schools, I felt a little superior since I studied in an international school in Bangkok and my father worked for a UN organization. That's what he said. I get married and got permanent residence, and I get my Philippine citizenship 1976. Marcos once gave citizenship to the Chinese under the special presidential decree. And I also applied for it and I won it. That is what he mentioned in his interview. Putting his sense of superiority on his personal background, his family and his personal background, not on the national identity. Because I'm Korean, so I feel like superior than you. That is not the national, the Korean identity was not involved in his superiority. His own or his family background became background of his superiority. Living as a legitimate Philippine citizen is because he got the citizenship. And also Filipinos, the locals, treat him as a superior foreigners. So he can, get along with the mainstream society in the Philippines. So that is a living environment make him not to be Koreans, not to be Filipinos, something else probably. So it is more clearly narratives on his nationality. I have no concept of being Korean only because I was born in Korea. It is important to me that it is convenient to learn about bags, his business, because I speak Korean. When I go to Korea for business, the same is true of the Philippines. Whether I go to America or any countries, it will be all the same. There is nothing emotional for me. I don't think that way. So that I determine his national identity, post-national identity. The nationality or national, his nation is not important for determining his identities. So he can be a both Korean and Filipino because he's born in Korea, born as Korean, and he is a citizen of Philippines, so he's a Filipino. He can be anything, and he can be a nothing. Actually, he told me that one of the students came to him to interview. So there was a question about his identity. You think you're Korean or you're Filipino? His answer is, I'm nothing. He told me that. So he gave no particular significance to national identities. Whether he live, he born, the nationality is not important for his identities. Actually, he told me that, then what do you think you are then? He said, probably I'm the proletariat. That is what he answered to me. In the comparative point of view, if China has similarities with China because the state has a huge influence. But in his case, there's no state influence for making his own identities. And also the group or his own, the society living. He did not belong to the Korean society in the Philippines. Independently, he lived by himself with his wife and his families. He did not attach to the Korean societies. Entire his living in the Philippines. One time he involved in some Korean community works, but he said he found no meaning to working there, so he did not go anymore. That's what he told me. That, and Philippine society does not impose its identity as a Korean. Okay? The Philippine society is quite free, and they respect of esteem the foreigners. So you don't need to be identify you as a nationals. Okay, compared to USA and Europe's, there's no racial discrimination in Philippine society, his host countries. And also, national identity as a Filipinos has no merit because the locals have more, has higher esteem for the foreigners. And also, he can, involved in the Philippine mainstream societies since he's a citizen and also he's a successful businessman. So he's a part of the mainstream society in the Philippines. So what determine his national identities? Personal factors, probably childhood memories, and also his independent mindset. Also structural factors, also there is the absence of the role of state and the living environment, the Philippines as a migrant space does not force him to choose a national identity, either Korean or Philippines, in order to have the better life. Okay. So this is the, I spent almost 1 hour. So this is concluding remarks. The Korean diaspora and Korean society in the Philippines could be understood more clearly by historical context with the changes of socioeconomic factors and other factors that affect the migration conditions. The study of national identity of Korean diaspora in the Philippines contribute to the field of Korean diaspora studies by offering a new case with different type and space of migration. At the policy level, policy aspects, a systematic support and proper programs are needed to keep royalties from the diaspora or strengthen their national identity. I think they need more support and programs for the overseas Koreans. Okay. So thank you very much, Maraming salamat po for listening my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for that very enlightening and very insightful talk. Thank you very much, sir. Before we proceed to the open forum, let us welcome Dr. Maria Elissa Jayme of the Ateneo Department of Political Science. Dr. Lau is an assistant professor at the Political Science Department of Ateneo de Manila University. And currently, she is the director of the University Gender and Development Office. She received her doctorate in public administration from the National College of Public Administration and Governance at the University of the Philippines, Diliman in 2011. She also sits as board member of the Philippine Migration Research Network, and her current research includes work on Philippine foreign policy, migration and Philippine elections, democratization in the Philippines, and DRR, resilience and social change. Dr. Lau, you may now share your reaction and insights.
Thank you, Professor Au, and thank you very much to Dr. Kim, who once upon a time was a colleague at the Department of Political Science in Ateneo. Also, thank you to UP for this kind invitation. Very happy to cooperate on shared areas of research and outreach. This presentation by Dr. Kim has really been very insightful, taking the long sweeping view of the history of Philippine-Korea relations in general, and then finally taking a more ethnographic turn and looking at a case of a Korean national who has found home in his own way in the Philippines. So I truly appreciated the input by Dr. Kim. And some of my comments now will echo what he has mentioned earlier, especially in the current day, where we find more and more Koreans in Philippine society, either via tourism or what they call tier tourism, industry, education, and retirement. So at this particular juncture, This is where we see many of our friends from Korea coming into the Philippines. In terms of tourism, for example, I think it was back in, so that portion where he mentions the increase in the number of Koreans in the Philippines around 2012, I think the numbers breached 1 million. And in 2011, of the 26,000 foreign students in the Philippines were Korean. So we can really see the increasing numbers in those two sectors. And as also Dr. Kim has mentioned, Koreans are here for longer term. And we've seen again in the early 2000s, this number has increased, partly, of course, due to the change in policy in Korea, where they allowed Koreans to leave the country. There was more mobility after that, and what he called enclave communities, and that's what I want to also explore now. Whereas before there were very tight knit Korean communities in Metro Manila, in Cebu, I think in Baguio, Davao were also mentioned in other research now. Where are they? Are they more integrated into Philippine society, for example? And also there has been assistance also to Korean nationals here in terms of protection, for example, in terms of service desks, as they move their businesses, their lives, their education here. And of course, they're also quite organized. Um, see, okay, they're also quite organized, and there are many associations, both here and in Korea, which have links to the Philippines. So I'd also like to inquire about what he knows about the level of organization of Koreans here in the Philippines. Um, so those are some of my comments, and in general, what I've heard before, doing work in the same area, is the preference for the Philippines has to do with, well, the favorable climate, English language learning, the low cost of living, and also the warmness of the culture. But I'm wondering if there are any other push or pull factors that are new, or that Dr. Kim has seen in terms of trends, or for example, opportunities. So are the patterns of mobility, why people go or stay, or why Koreans go or stay, changing, especially in this post-pandemic situation? And finally, what I find interesting about this is that we're looking at the Philippines now as a host country, and it makes us also ask the question of how do we how we perform. So how have we actually been as a host country? How have we looked at? So the same with the questions of Dr. Kim on how Koreans, for example, have looked at living and working and studying the Philippines. How has the Philippines as a host society looked at other cultures coming in and interacting? And I know that he said earlier that we there is a preference for foreigners, or for example, we do not impose, for example, identities on other other cultures coming into the Philippines. But the question of how, in general, do we fare as host country is something that I think would be also very interesting to interrogate. Ayon. So same with the parting words of Dr. Kim for this particular point in the program. Maraming salamat po again to UP and to Dr. Kim for this opportunity to discuss and to comment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lau, for your very valuable insights. Dr. Kim, would you like to share your thoughts on Dr. Lau's reaction, or would you like to answer some of her questions?
Yes. Thank you very much for listening very long my talk. I did not because you didn't. If you give me the time limitation, I try to. I mean, make it short, but it took almost 1 hour. I'm very sorry, and thank you very much, Melissa. I'm very happy to see you in even this online. I just get two questions from you. All the comments you make the very valuable comments, and the new mobility or the new motivation or reasons Korean to move to or migrate to the Philippines post pandemic areas. I probably there's some I'm not very sure, but during pandemic times, I think there are so many changes, but it became normalized. Probably again, many Koreans will go to Philippines. The reason why the Korean go to Philippines, of course, they initially they go to as a tourist or some language learnings, the English learnings. Once they visit the Philippines and they experience the Philippine society, they feel very comfortable. My case also very similar. Once you experience the Philippines, you feel like very free because the Korean society is more tight. Once you want to do some things, there are so many competitions, always tensed our societies. But once you visit the Philippines, you feel free, and that kind of atmosphere giving the Koreans, they stay there and they look for something to do there, and they found a new life. Probably in the post-pandemic areas, I think many Koreans will follow the same steps. And another one is probably I mentioned in my presentation that there will be many intermarriage couples. They settle down in the Philippines. Previously, the couples they live in the Korean societies, many of them. But I think gradually, many Korean Filipino couples they move to Philippines and they will settle down there. So I think the number will be increased in the post-pandemic eras. And in the first question, I already mentioned that the living environment in the Philippines. But the Koreans go there and they feel very free and they like to stay there longer. But only that kind of feelings you cannot live there as your life, right? You should do some things and you have to productive in that. If not, you just enjoy your retirement. That is fine. But once you are young and you have to do some economic activities. But in case of Philippines, there are many limitations for foreigners to do their own businesses, or there are many. The law prohibit many things. So that kind of things, one of the hurdle for Koreans settle down. Some of them they just go. Probably they have some find their own way, but it's not really legal method. But they try to find a way to do business. But those kind of legal and some institutional hurdles make the Koreans live there. If that kind of hurdle lifted, probably more Koreans will go, because the Philippines is quite, in terms of distance, very near, and you have totally different environment. And also there are so many for Koreans, you can find so many opportunities in Philippine societies. So I think it's if the two countries has more engaging to changing those kind of environment. More Koreans go to Philippines and live there successfully and happily. That is, I hope this answer your questions, Melissa. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Dr. Lau, would you like to react some more to what Dr. Kim has just shared?
Thanks, Dr. Kim. I think that this space we are in right now, the post-pandemic space, leaves a lot of us of just room to sort of redefine mobilities.
Mhm.
So I'm interested to see whether what you have mentioned is something that we will see more of. For example, you mentioned with marriage between Koreans and Filipinos more settling in the Philippines. And because with some changes in, for example, ease of doing business, maybe more businesses in the Philippines. Even before the pandemic, I've seen many Korean students actually make it all the way to university in the Philippines. Even in Ateneo, we always now have one or two students, at least in our own department of Korean heritage, which was not true when you were in the department. Right now, I don't know if they're watching now, but I actually have two exchange students from Korea in my international relations classes. So I think that the exchange, no, the exchanges will continue, and the question is, in what forms, in what new forms will they take? So quite excited for the space that we are in now. Um, any comment on on the geographic location? I think that was my other question because, as you mentioned earlier, they were in very tight knit communities, enclaves of Korean communities. Do you see any changes in those patterns as well?
Yeah, because there is some Koreans. There are some areas the Korean community was strong. In Makati also they have also in Manila and also in Angeles also we have some Korean community there, and uh, in Cebu also there are very strong Korean communities. Actually, previously it's changed after 1990s. Most of Koreans, once you go to Philippines, you go Manila. But these days they don't go Manila because it's traffic and not much things to see for them as a tourist or whatever. So they go directly to the Angeles, they go to Cebu, even Davao, because we have the direct flight from Korea to local in the Philippines. So the Koreans, they disperse whole entire Philippines island. So I mean, geographically, the Koreans, I mean, they scattered everywhere in the Philippines. And well, the Philippines, as I mentioned, that is very in terms of the distance, is quite near. It's 3.5 hours flight. So whenever you have mind, you can go to the Philippines in anywhere in the Philippines. I think it more localized. The Koreans are the interaction with the local peoples are more increasing than now. They did not does not concentrate in certain areas. So I think it is increasingly I mean spread out all the areas. So I'm not clearly answer your questions. So I'm afraid that is that what you asked or?
Yes. Thank you. Thank
Mm.
you very much for your intervention on that question.
Thank you very much once again, Drs. Kim and Lau. The session is now open for questions and comments. You may send them through the YouTube live chat box. If possible, please introduce yourself with your affiliation when raising your questions. I will be reading a few questions that have been collected throughout the session. Okay, so we have here our first question from um, Dr. Jovi M. Peregrino. Professor Kim, how do Koreans in the Philippines view Filipino identity and culture?
Okay, Dr. Jovi, nice to see you in this platform. Actually, Dr. Jovi was the visiting professor to our university, and we are close friends. Well, how do Koreans in the Philippines view Filipino identity and cultures? Probably I was Koreans living quite long time in the Philippines. Upon my experience, Filipinos they have national pride, but in terms of identity, I felt that they have some weakness. I have one Filipino friend. He told me that he want to study in Australia. Once he go Australia, he will not come back. He want to be Australian. So I think many Filipino who living in America, they also do same, right? I think it's not the problem of the person. It's a problem of the country and the government. They should make their people proud to be their own nations. I think the Philippines also the government have some effort, but I think try to more became proud of being the Filipinos. Cultures. I think the Philippine culture is quite because I study Southeast Asia. The Philippine culture is a little bit. There's a real difference from the other Southeast Asian peoples. I think the Filipino culture is more westernized than countries in other countries in Southeast Asia, and you are very much. I think it's American influence. You have very strict. I mean, in terms of rule divisions and in terms of contracts. And in Korea, we just you meet and you talk. That is it. But in the Philippines, you have to sign the document. That kind of culture is a little bit different from what we have in Korea. So I hope to see you, Professor Jovi, in the near future. Recently, he visited Korea, and I met him in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you. We have here another interesting question from Dr. Aldrin Lee. And he is wondering if Koreans who graduated in Philippine universities have formed any association or a society.
Yes, we have. We have the UP Alumni Association Korean chapter. We have, I think the membership is around, I think 100. I'm also a member of that association. And I think other university, UST also, they have their own associations. So the Koreans, they have their own associations, but because of this pandemic, before the pandemic, every year, I think one or twice we meet. We have the meeting in Seoul, and we make the structure of the association. We elect the president, and so we have the association and societies. I have some the UP graduate. We meet each other. Before it was quite open. We met. We met and we get along together. But these days it became. I think it's because of the pandemic, and probably before there are many Koreans studying in the Philippines, especially. We combine with the UP Diliman and UP LB because there are many graduates from the LB, UP LB, and they are very high officer in the Korean one of the office in Korea. So we have very close contact, and we combine these two associations as a UP Alumni Association. Okay, my answer is yes.
Okay, so we have here another. I think it's a comment.
Mhm.
Yes, from Atsumasa Nagata. Maraming salamat po kay Dr. Kim Dong-yeob. This is very interesting. This is a very interesting presentation and has helped me understand more the historical process of migration from Korea to the Philippines.
Thank you.
Probably Korean Philippines Mutual Academic Research probably there will be more Korean Philippines academic research that would constitute to make more progress.
Mhm.
Korean roots second generation in the Philippines and Philippines with Philippines roots next generation in South Korea have more chances to get in touch with Korea or the Philippines culture and get more information.
I think that is a very important point. The second generation of intermarriage, the Korean Philippine families. In Korea, we have a number of the childrens. I think they are the one who can contribute, or is a huge asset for improving or strengthening mutual relationships, because they can speak Koreans and Filipinos, and also they have the cultural and family ties between these two countries. So they can be a very important bridge between these two countries. I think they, so in order to make them to be, take that kind of roles, those second generation in Korea, they have to learn about the Philippines, languages, culture. So get used to about the Philippine society. And also probably the second generation in Korea, in the Philippines, also learn about the Korean. So that is, they have the another kind of identities, and that identity will benefit for both countries. So I think that is very good point. And both government, Korea and the Philippines, make more concern and give more effort to educate and train and encourage them to be that kind of doing that kind of roles. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. You may still type in your questions. Okay, this is from Dr. Kyung Min Bae. In your research, did you also encounter younger or newer generations of Korean migrants to the Philippines? How, or would you say, is their identity development different from the old timers, like Mr. Yong Chan Kim and his generation?
So I think the period, the migration time is important. And in my research, the Korea is in terms of national identities. For example, like you may know the term about the passport power, right? The Korean passport power is quite strong. You can go almost every countries in the world without visa. So they don't. They just identify themselves as Koreans. They don't want to give up their own national identities. If you go to Philippines as a young, but still, even though you don't speak Korean, but still you want to keep the Korean identity with passport. So I think that kind of things is a trend these days. Probably if the Philippines developed more and the soft power of the Philippines is stronger or equal to Korea's, probably it can be changed. In terms of the Mr. Yongchan Kim, his very unique case, and also his period of migrations, he doesn't need to choose any identities. So these young Koreans who live in Philippines, I think they keep Korean identities. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have another question here from Dr. Ronel Laranjo. Older Filipinos know Koreans as soldiers during the Japanese occupation. Did your research include the extent of participation of Koreans during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines? 감사합니다.
Professor Ronel is also a very close friend of mine, and he speaks very good Korean. And whenever I have question about Filipino, I ask him because he connect to KakaoTalk with me. Anyway, your question is very important questions. I mentioned about the case of the Hong Saik in my presentation. He was a Korean origin, but he joined the Imperial Japanese Army and he dispatched to the Philippines. And he sentenced death and he executed in the Philippines. So that story, and also probably some of you, if you are, I think if you are a little bit aged, you must know there's some rumor about that. During this Japanese occupation of the Philippines, there is some atrocities done by the soldiers to Filipinos. It's not Japanese, it's a Korean. That probably some of you heard about that kind of rumors. Because during that times, many Korean soldiers was not voluntarily, but forced to join the this Japanese Imperial Army, and they dispatched it to the Philippines. And most of them, many of them, they served as a prison guard. So there is some probably there is some Korean origin, but during that times you cannot say he is Korean because he is a part of Japanese armies. He has no Korean nationalities. He is Japanese, but still there are some rumors. And in Ateneo Pol-Sci department, late Dr. Jose Lydia Jose, she wrote an article and published in the good journals about that rumors. Is it true or not? Her finding, because she studied in Japan, so she make the reference to Japanese documents. But according to her conclusion, it's not true. Probably it was false misinformation about during that times. So, of course, during that times, Japanese colonial or Japanese occupation of the Philippines, many Korean origin go to the Philippines. And once the war ended, they returned to Korea, and some of them returned to other countries. So that is true. There are some Korean soldiers, they go to the Philippines, but not as Korean armies, but Japanese armies. Thank you.
Okay, so we have another question here, Dr. Kim. Hi, what overarching themes emerge from the narratives based on the limits of your research? What can you suggest for researchers in the future to focus on when it comes to Korean migrants in Southeast Asia?
That is very good questions, and when I research about Korean migrant in the Philippines, I was encountered a lot of difficulties because there's no data or there's no proper reference. There's no accumulation of the data. And fortunately, I could meet the first generation of Korean migrant in the Philippines. And I interviewed. If you remember in my presentation, there is one picture with the old men. They are the Korean silver societies in the Philippines. Already, some of them already passed away. So those Korean migrants or Korean diaspora in Southeast Asia, the history is not long, and you can still find the first generations. So important thing is you have to leave the record how they come to these countries and how they live there, how they settle down there. In the young men, they will live there a long time, so we have chance to doing research about them. But these old generations, the first generations, I think we don't have many times to interview them. So this narrative interview method is important, and try to find the old men and try to get their stories, life stories, and make records. So in the future, if there are some scholars may interested in study about Korean migration in Southeast Asia, they can make it reference, even though you did not make it as a paper or books, but still the record itself is important. I think that is a first step we have to do for studying in Korean migrant in Southeast Asia. Thank you. Yes, yeah, of course. Professor Javier, please unmute your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that. Sorry, sir. Okay, so as I was saying, while I was muted. Okay, so any last comments, Dr. Lau and Dr. Kim?
Professor Melissa, you go first.
Okay. Just two things which I picked up from Dr. Kim's presentation, which I think is worth repeating. Number one is to take a multi-generational look, since there have been several generations of Koreans living in the Philippines, is indeed a worthwhile undertaking and really requires more research and understanding. And secondly, the concept of transnationalism, which I think we only talked about a little bit, and because identities in this context really haven't been discussed again in research and in the context of transnational sort of linkages or just the way they locate themselves into different places is also another thing which I think will be very interesting for future study. So thank you, Dr. Kim, for your presentation.
Okay, thank you. That is quite your last comments. Transnationalism is quite important subject to study. Actually, as I mentioned, that the Philippines is not the country which is far away. It's very near. Actually, you can have lunch in the Philippines and come back to Korea in a day. So this transnationalism is even if you're Korean migrant in the Philippines, I saw many cases. You have the office in Korea and office in the Philippines. So very frequently you come and go. And every time we have the free communication method, right? So even if you stay in the Philippines, nothing different while you're staying in Korea or in the Philippines. You can communicate, you can meet in the virtual space, face to face. And so you don't feel like before, unlike before, you're very hard to communicate with the people in Korea. But now it's very easy. So this space and no longer important, and the type of migration and the lifestyles is truly transnational. I think this kind of trends will exceed more. Onward. So thank you very much for Elissa, Dr. Javier, and all audience and my friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me this very important talk. Congress, right? Congress. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I really enjoy for the time here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. And that concludes our open forum. For those who want to receive a certificate of attendance, kindly fill out the form. The link to the form is being flashed on the screen. There you go. Please do submit the evaluation form so you will be issued a certificate of attendance. And with that, we formally conclude today's event. Thank you very much again for joining us, everyone. For other updates or future events, please visit the UPKRC Facebook page and also visit UPKRC's YouTube channel to access the recording of today's lecture. We hope to see you again in our future events. Thank you and have a safe and happy weekend, everyone. 감사합니다. Maraming salamat po.